Can you say, "This is Dr. Amanda Zelahusky"?
Why do we have to?
Just try it.
Oh, I can't.
Deep breath. Okay.
This is Dr. Amanda Zelahusky. Lindsay Malloy. Ah!
Now, wait, say Dr. Lindsay Malloy.
Dr. Lindsay Malloy.
No, come back.
This is Dr. Lindsay Malloy. Welcome to the Parenting podcast.
One more time.
And then after that, can we have a candy after?
No.
Please, Mommy.
Okay, ready?
Syndemic Parenting podcast.
Excellent.
Welcome to the Pandemic Parenting Podcast. I'm Dr. Amanda Zelahusky, one of the co-founders of Pandemic Parenting. As psychologists, scholars, and moms, my colleague Dr. Lindsay Malloy and I share science-based research to help all who care for kids navigate this challenging time together. This episode is the second in a two-part series on trauma-informed parenting. I had the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Julian Ford about why the pandemic has been so hard for parents, especially parents who are essential workers or work in healthcare, and what it means to be a trauma-informed parent. Dr. Ford is an expert in trauma that I've looked up to for many years and learned a lot from. I really appreciated his emphasis on making sure our children feel secure, and I absolutely loved the ABC parenting tool he developed and taught me during our conversation. If you haven't already, I hope you check out the first part of this series with Dr. Jennifer Sirico, where we talked more specifically about the ways children respond to stress and the collective trauma we've all experienced to different degrees during the pandemic. Okay, let's get to the conversation. So welcome, Dr. Julian Ford. We're really excited to have you talking with us today on the podcast. And so you and I have known each other in various spheres over the years, just different sort of trauma circles and research work. And I've always just really been a big admirer and fan of your work and learned a lot from you over the years. So I'm really excited you're here to talk with us today, and just wondered if you could tell us a little bit about your background, your role now, and maybe even just how you got interested in working with trauma.
Thank you, Amanda. It's a pleasure to do this. I'm a very big fan of your work as well. And I think that this blog for parents is a wonderful thing.
Thank you.
I'm a clinical psychologist, so I'm a shrink, but I try to stay in the real world. What I've learned about helping people in recovery from trauma, that's been my focus of many years of my career. Most of what I've learned has been from the people who I've had the privilege of counseling. I've learned some from textbooks. I've done some research. I've worked on developing approaches to therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. But I have to say that the most valuable learning I've had has come from kids, from parents, from the clients I see.
Yeah, absolutely. Gosh, and we're learning so much more this past year, especially. Things are impacting our families and our functioning. So let's just sort of start with that word trauma that we were both using. So because we're talking mostly to parents and and that's a term that, I think you and I have both seen in our work over the years, has just started to be used a lot more sort of conversationally with people, or maybe misused, people saying, "Oh, I'm so traumatized by this or that." So I'm just wondering if you can say a little bit about, what your understanding is of what is meant by trauma.
And that is a great question and point, because the trauma is increasingly used as we've all been experiencing the many, many stressors involved with coping with this pandemic. The important thing to start with is that trauma is a form of stress. It's an extreme form of stress. And what makes it extreme compared to other stressors, which also have a really important effect, like not being able to have kids go to school, stressful for kids, very stressful for parents at home, worried about getting the virus and needing to be very careful about being protective and social distancing. Those are stressors that we're all dealing with, and many others. What makes a stressor traumatic is when it is so shocking or it is so potentially dangerous that it creates a reaction of fear or sometimes of shame. Those are the two reactions that I think are most important to be aware of when we think about trauma. When children experience trauma, they either are very, very frightened, and by that I mean frightened for their lives or for the lives of the people that they count on, depend upon, care about, or they may not be terrified, but they may feel deeply ashamed.
Mm.
So some forms of trauma and some forms, for example, of abuse or maltreatment do not involve a threat of death, but they are traumatizing because they undermine a child's or an adult's basic sense of their own worth and their own value.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I think of trauma. It's an extreme form of stress, and the stress reactions that happen when a child or a family experience trauma are a more extreme and more intense version of the stress reactions that we're all coping with every day.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. So let's talk about this past year then. So like when you say, that we're all coping with every day, well, our everyday coping for the last year has looked a lot different probably for many of us than our everyday coping a year before. So what do you think about the pandemic and, is our experience this past year a trauma?
It is a trauma for some of us. It is very stressful.
Yeah.
It has been traumatic for some of us. And primarily, that's if we, or if an individual has experienced a very direct threat to their own life. For example, healthcare workers who have worked with very seriously ill individuals and have had to be very concerned about catching the virus, or individuals who may not have anything to do with healthcare at all, but any of us who have lost someone who we love or who we've been close to. That is another form of trauma that I should add, where it actually, a third reaction that's really important to understand, and that is sometimes trauma can lead to very, very strong sense of grief. And that's the kind of trauma that involves a loss if someone close to us dies or becomes very severely ill, and we're really scared that they could die, even if they make it through. It can be very traumatic for children if someone they know, especially a parent or a caregiver, but it could be someone else who they know, if that individual has had a close brush with death because of COVID, that can be traumatic for children too, because it raises the possibility that they may lose that person from their life. And that is one form of trauma.
At Pandemic Parenting, we're committed to sharing our expertise and research in ways that are immediately accessible and useful to families. As part of our efforts to sustain and expand this work, Lindsay and I are also available for virtual speaking engagements at your business, organization, PTO, and more. We want to help you and those who you work with, grow with, and raise your children with have the chance to do so in an environment that fosters and supports your mental health. Some of the topics we enjoy speaking on include parenting during the pandemic, the impact of trauma on children and families, children's development, the mental health impact of COVID-19 on employees, and more. If you or your organization are interested in potentially collaborating, please reach out to us for availability and pricing through the Request a Speaker form on our website at www.pandemic-parent.org/contact. I was thinking about a lot of the things that you were just saying, and especially wondering, as we've sort of seen a lot of these different headlines, seen lots of the research coming out, like the pandemic seems to be hitting parents especially hard. And so I'm just wondering, your thoughts about that. Like, why has this been so hard, particularly on parents, as opposed to lots of other groups in society?
Well, I think we all know, or we should all know, that parents have had a lot of extra work because kids have had to stay home, families have had to stay home, and 24/7 with family can be a wonderful experience, but it is stressful. There's no way around it. Even with the best family, the best parents, the best kids, it's still just stressful to have to be together for prolonged periods of time. So that's one of the things that I know has weighed on all parents, and it should not be taken lightly. It's not a trauma, but it is very stressful. But in addition to that, I think what's particularly stressful for parents is that they want to protect their children. They also want to protect other loved ones, their spouse or partner, other family members. And so the parenting instinct to be protective has been really, really ramped up with the pandemic, because we've all felt a need to be much more cautious and to be much more careful and to protect those who we care about. So I think for parents, that's added a kind of an invisible extra load of concern that's sometimes not even consciously recognized, because it's just so natural for parents to be caring. If you think of parents as having just so much bandwidth to allocate to provide caring, and now parents are trying to protect so many different people, including their children, it just becomes much harder to then focus on children.
Yeah, gosh, absolutely. Oh, I was feeling everything you were saying in my bones, Julian. Like it just, your job as a parent essentially is to, keep your child safe and help them grow up in the world in a way that hopefully helps them thrive. And so, right. So feeling like I don't even know how to keep my kids safe in this because I don't know how to keep myself safe, or there just aren't answers. There isn't a roadmap for us. And so, yeah, I think that invisible load piece you talked about has just been huge, with no clear guidance on how to make a lot of these decisions. So I want to just talk about one other layer before we dive into trauma specifically. Because I think there's just been a lot going on in our social and political climate, of course, too. And I heard you in one of the meetings we were in together not too long ago use the term syndemic, which is the first I'd really heard anybody talk about this that way. And that was really intriguing to me. So I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about that.
Syndemic is a term that it's based on the word epidemic, which we all unfortunately know, or pandemic, which we also all know with COVID. Syndemic just is referencing the fact that at the same time that the COVID pandemic is occurring, there are some other major upheavals that are occurring for all of us as we are more and more awakened and aware to the need to address the kinds of tragic burdens that racism has created for so many people in our country and across the world. That awakening and the very important push to reduce the oppression that can occur because of racism, that's been a whole nother challenge. And then for many parents and many families, the pandemic has been such an incredible strain for them on their economics. The jobs have often been in peril or lost. Incomes have been drastically cut. Housing has become uncertain. Sometimes food has become difficult to find, or just impossible because of the economic changes. So what we're seeing is a combination of multiple epidemics. And that's what a syndemic is. It's not just one pandemic. And that's just a reminder for all of us that this has not just been because of the virus. This has also this has occurred because we're all grappling with multiple challenges that we need to face. And when they all hit at once, it's a lot to deal with.
Yeah. Yes. And it is. It's just on this like really long continuum of how people have been impacted. I read an article yesterday that talked about, you mentioned food insecurity, that 1 in 4 families experienced food insecurity at some point in the past year, which is just such a striking statistic to me, along with, hosts of other statistics like that, unfortunately, for how, what you were saying earlier, like we're just experiencing this in different ways. And there's lots of extra layers for many families related to this notion of a syndemic. So thinking about that kind of continuum then, how can I start to figure out if, one of the worries we've gotten from a lot of parents, right? How do I know if my child is traumatized by this past year or by the, pandemic or any domino effects because of it? So how can we help parents sort out whether their kid is, quote unquote, traumatized?
We can't, as parents, and even mental health providers, can't always be absolutely sure that it's because a child's been traumatized. But the kinds of stress reactions that occur when a child is traumatized or sometimes when children and families are experiencing multiple stressors that are not traumatic, but are still extremely difficult, as we've been discussing. The reactions I think that are important for parents to be aware of are when a child shows more signs of anxiety or fearfulness than they have previously. And it may seem that the anxiety is not based on the real situation, and that maybe your son or daughter is too worried about things or too upset about small things. What that typically means is that a child is upset not necessarily about the specific things that they are focusing on or that are most evident, but it's usually because they are fundamentally feeling a sense of insecurity. And insecurity, I think, is really the hallmark of the post-traumatic stress reaction. It can take the form of anxiety, it can take the form of being irritable, it can take the form of not sleeping as well, having difficulties going to sleep, needing more sleep. It can take the form of having difficulties in concentration, and that can lead to difficulties at school, which of course are compounded by not having the regular school experience and having to do virtual learning. But over and above that, if a son or a daughter is experiencing real difficulties with just following through with readings, with schoolwork, with school projects, with learning, that's another potential sign. Again, all of these can be for many different reasons. Trauma is only one of them. But the fundamental issue then is what's happening in this child's life that's causing them to feel a sense of insecurity. And that's where I think parents can make a very big difference without trying to diagnose, without trying to decide exactly what the problem is, and without trying to fix every single thing that a child may be upset about or frustrated about or worried about. When you try to plug every hole in the dike, it's impossible. But sometimes if you figure out what's happened to the dike, to the floodgate, what's opened the floodgate, I think very often the common denominator is insecurity. And that's what I think parents can actually make an enormous positive difference in helping their children with.
Yeah. So, okay, but how? Like, this is a whole year full of insecurity. How do I help my children feel more secure when I don't have answers to all of these questions? When can we do this and when will this change? And so, yes, how?
Well, you put it very well, because as a parent myself, I'm now a grandparent, but I have been a parent. I know very well that when one of my daughters was upset or worried or angry about something, my first thought always is, how can I fix the immediate situation?
Yeah.
And that is important, but very often that's not the real fix. Very often the real question for the child, whether they're a little kid or whether they're an adolescent, is, can I trust that I'm going to be all right, that we're going to be all right? Now, of course, parents cannot tell their children that they are definitely not going to get the virus, that everything's going to be perfectly fine, that everybody in their family is going to be perfectly fine. The best way I can describe the approach that I think parents take when they are most reassuring for their children is ABC. First, the A is they're available. Availability is when a parent finds time on a regular basis to just be with their child and be interested in whatever their child is doing or is interested in, even if their child is a teenager and acts like they don't want anything to do with you, okay? Expressing that interest genuinely, offering and being in their presence and being available to them if they have something to say. What happens very often is then kids will go for a while before they actually ever say what's really on their minds. But if this happens often enough, even if it's only for a few minutes at a time, sooner or later, children begin to kind of let down and they realize, okay, mom or dad, they're here, and I can let them know what's really bothering me or what I really need or the question I really need answered. So availability is number one. The B is be present in that moment. And that's something, we psychologists, mental health people talk about this all the time. And mindfulness is a really wonderful thing. But it doesn't have to be through deep meditation. It can be in a very down-to-earth, basic way of just clearing your mind and just focusing on who you're with right at that moment. So being very present with a child means simply putting everything else as much as possible aside. It's not always completely possible. And just focusing, even for a short time, on just enjoying and the value of being with your child. Even if your child is going through a phase where they don't like you or where they're being really, really oppositional, to just focus even for a few moments on what you know and love and value about that child. And another way to think of that is when you're really present with your child, you are conveying a very crucial message, which is that you believe in and value your child. So that's another way of thinking of the B, to convey, I believe in this son, this boy or girl. I know they're going through a hard time. I know they're frustrating for me, or I'm worried about them, or they don't seem to want to have anything to do with me, or they need more than I can do. They have questions I can't answer. Just putting all that momentarily aside and just remembering, what is it about this son or daughter, this child, that you really believe in and value? And that's being present. So availability, be present and believe in your child. And then the C is to think clearly. And clear thinking, for the C, is actually the biggest challenge for all of us when we're stressed. I do not think very clearly when I am extremely stressed unless I make a real concerted effort. And I remember the most important thing now is not how frustrated I am, how worried I am, the question I have to answer, whether I'm a good enough parent or whether I'm not. What's most important right now is I need to be able to just think clearly about what is it that my child needs from me right at this moment. And I may not know exactly what that is, but as long as I'm thinking clearly, I'll start to figure out, maybe she or he just needs me to back off and ask fewer questions and not be pushing about the schoolwork for just a little bit and be more of a friend. Maybe on the other hand, what she or he needs is a little bit of help with the schoolwork. And I've been just thinking I should just leave that and let her or him be completely independent. There is no single answer, and there's no right or wrong answer, but just the process of thinking, what does my child need, and what is most important for my child right at this moment?
Oh, what a great way to remember those. Yeah. And I think that's just so nice and tangible. And you're right that all three of those steps, I think, would have been really hard for parents this year, will continue to be hard, far beyond the pandemic too. The busier we are, the harder it is to do all of those things, be available, be present, and think clearly. And so I just think about the multitasking, we've all had to do this year so much more than ever. And how much of it is, I'm sitting and responding to an email while my child's here needing help. And that, and it's just, we're trying to do all of the things at once at the same time. And so I think you're right, though. I've seen when I can just stop and really, even if it is just for 5 minutes a day with each child, like they have 100% my undivided attention, it really can be a game changer, that they just feel seen. And I've found that it gives a little more grace for me making mistakes and maybe being a little more irritable later. Like, it's just, I'm building up some of those reserves with each member of my family when I can do that. But I think there's also grace for the parents in this, that, you know what, if you couldn't do that yesterday, or you can't do that every day, or it was just a really rough day, we get do-overs. And it's the most amazing thing about parenting, is that, you get to get up and try again tomorrow and remember that, I just really wasn't as present. And so today I'm going to try to make a much more concerted effort, and really, be mindful and be present with my child. So
that's a great way of describing it, Amanda. And it's a really good example too. And you will find, I'm sure, that at some point, some of your children will say, how come only 5 minutes, Mom?
I know. It is never enough, right?
But what they're really saying there is, I really appreciate the 5 minutes. It would be great to do more. And they're trying to kind of push you and get a little more. don't give in. The 5
Yeah.
minutes is crucial, and sometimes it's 10 minutes, sometimes it's a whole afternoon. Of course, it's very different, but what you said is that it's that minimum down payment that is really crucial. That way you don't have a big balloon payment later. You're paying
Yes.
it off gradually, and you're paying forward
Yeah.
by actually, rather than waiting for a crisis when your child is upset and then you give them attention, which
Yep.
of course is still very important to do, but to be able to do it when they don't necessarily need anything, but what you know is they do need your presence. Now that raises one other really crucial point, which I know is probably very obvious to you and to all of your listeners, but I will just say it, and that is that the ABCs start with us as people. If you're going to do this for your child, you have to do this for yourself. And you have to do this in your most important relationships outside of being a parent as well, but especially just for yourself. Now, I realize that may sound like, touchy-feely mental health advice, but it's basically just a way of saying, okay, we all need to take a little bit of time on a regular basis and just step back and clear our minds and be available to ourselves and be present and believe in and remember what we believe in about ourselves, even if we're really doubting ourselves, even if we're feeling like we're not succeeding, to go back to that. What are the core values? What is it that I know about myself that I can really believe in, even if I need to work harder at it? And then the thinking clearly is, what is it that I really need to pay attention to right now in my life? And it may be something that I hadn't even been thinking about until I took 2 minutes and just stepped back and cleared my mind.
Yeah. Yeah. It's been such a theme of so many things we've talked about in the pandemic parenting work, is this notion of taking care of yourself as the parent, that's really critical. And in some cases the most important, but the challenge and sort of juxtaposition of that with like, I don't have time for self-care. Are you kidding me? When am I supposed to fit that in? So I think that's a really interesting way to think about what that looks like, that it doesn't mean, fit in whatever, the 1 hour exercise class, or that, it is a way to emotionally engage in that self-care. And it can take you 30 seconds and you can do it 100 times a day if you need to just sort of stop and check in and do your ABCs. I really like that.
I think you explained it perfectly.
So if we think about these sort of extremes, though, I think it's been helpful the way you've been breaking down sort of these stressful experiences versus, what can actually be considered traumatic. So as a parent, like, how do I know when this actually might be trauma for my child, and maybe then when I should be seeking help, outside help for them?
The most important consideration is when any of these stress reactions, and again, as parents, we may not know whether they're because of trauma or because of many other stressors, but when the stress reactions that a child is experiencing and that we're seeing as their parent, when they really compromise your child's ability to just do the things that he or she should be able to do and has been able to do, when you see that kind of a dropping off from being a B plus student to being a C minus student, or when you see that your child is just having really hard time waking up every morning because they just can't seem to fall asleep at night, or their sleep is just very disrupted throughout the night, or when you see that they're having trouble getting along with family members or with their friends because they just seem so irritable. I would not say that means that they necessarily have a diagnosable mental health problem, but they are telling you that they're having a hard time coping. And frankly, the most important mental health counseling is not based on diagnoses. It's based on simply helping people to find the ways to shift and regenerate and rejuvenate their coping resources. And that's different than how people often think about mental health treatment, where you have to have a diagnosis.
Right.
And sometimes you do need a diagnosis for insurance purposes, for example. But for the purposes of thinking, can mental health counseling be helpful? the important question is not whether there's a diagnosis. The question is, could this child use some help because they're having trouble coping and they just need some guidance and support to help bolster their ability to cope so that they can get back to doing things the way that they have done in the past and the way that they're capable of doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think especially when you know there may be transitions coming up, like you see they're starting to struggle a little bit, and I know, okay, there's a big transition, whether that's we're about to go back to school or it's about to be summer or whatever's going to be just sort of another shift. I think that you and I probably both see a lot in our work. People wait to access counseling for themselves and for their kids until they're in absolute crisis. Like an athletic trainer, when you're on a team, like you don't wait to start working with the trainer until you've already torn your ACL, right? You're working with them because they're helping to strengthen your muscle and showing you stretches. And all of this is to help you actually prevent injury or not exacerbate an existing injury. And so I think it's very similar for counseling, that what we're trying to encourage here is go now, before it gets really bad. And so that you're teaching your child and yourself, these ways to sort of help cope before the massive crisis comes.
Exactly. An ounce of prevention is always worth at least a pound of cure.
Mm-hmm.
And working with that trainer before you're injured is going to get you far more benefit. Now, I think that, of course, as a parent, I would be concerned, does it mean that there's something wrong with my child if I take them for mental health counseling? Does it mean there's something wrong with me, that I'm a bad parent?
Right.
And of course, that feeling that you're essentially, you're taking on the extra burden of stigma or your child is, that's really important to address, because that's why mental health counseling should always be private and confidential.
Mm-hmm.
And it should not be based upon the diagnosis primarily. It's important if a child has a diagnosable mental health disorder, that's important to recognize, and there are excellent treatments, but it's also equally plausible and more common and more likely the case that there isn't necessarily a diagnosis that's the main focus. It's simply that your child is having difficulties because they're feeling anxious, they're feeling frustrated, they're feeling cooped up, and a good mental health provider will help them not overcome a disorder, but will help them develop their coping skills.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think helping to shift the narrative too, like this is a challenge a lot of times when we're just explaining as parents to kids, why we're going to go see the counselor and what it's going to be helpful for. And it's really shifting out of this idea, which is talked a lot about in, trauma spaces, from, what's wrong with you to what happened to you. And so it's helping your child, something happened that we didn't want to happen in our family or, in our circumstance. And so we're going to figure out ways to help us through that, as opposed to thinking about it as being, something wrong with my child or wrong with me as a parent, like you said, because we tend to take so much of that blame onto ourselves. If I only would have done this, or I should have done this. And that is a lot of, our guilt of working through whatever it is that happened that we couldn't prevent, which is just hard to take on as a parent. Yeah.
And it's always important for parents to know and for providers to be very clear that parents are not the cause of mental health problems. They are actually the medicine. And the medicine is not a pill, and it's not a treatment. It's having that kind of sense of security that comes from parents showing you that they are available, they believe in you, and that they know how to think clearly, and they can help you to think clearly.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. I wanted to just go back to something you brought up earlier, which I know is a particular area of expertise for you, and something I've been thinking a lot about, which is parents who are healthcare workers, and what this specifically has been like for them. I have a lot of family members who are healthcare workers, myself. And so this has just even looked differently, even that much more stressful for healthcare parents. And because I know you work a lot in those contexts, I wondered if you just have any specific, any recommendations or thoughts for all of the parents out there who have been working tirelessly for the last year, especially.
Well, of course, the first thought is how much credit and how much inspiration they provided for all of us. So every healthcare worker who has put their own safety and their own life on the line and cared for others is a real, truly a hero. But beyond being a hero, what I think is probably most important to know, when healthcare workers are parents, they're every day that they go back home after they've been working. And this is also true, not just for healthcare workers, but also for essential employees who
Yeah,
are also putting their own safety on the line
that's
and
right.
doing things to make sure that we all have the food that we need and the other things in our lives. And so every single one of those individuals, when they go home at night or in the morning, if they're working the night shift, they're always going to be concerned that they're bringing home the virus, that they're somehow going to unintentionally harm their children or their family. And there is no way to absolutely remove that concern. It's a valid concern, but it is also not something that should ever be a cause for guilt or for separating oneself from one's family or children, except insofar as you have to quarantine if you know that you've been exposed or if you know that you have the virus. But separate from that, every time that healthcare workers or essential employees go home to their families, it's really important that they have a ritual. And I've heard so many different versions of this. Whatever the ritual is that feels best for that individual, to basically shed the clothing and make sure that they have cleansed themselves, whether it's a shower or in whatever way that they feel is important. And that's not just a physical thing. That's an opportunity to actually, at those times, to basically separate oneself from all the stress and the burden of caring for others and refocus on being together with family. And that transition, I think, it makes all the difference. Sometimes it's very difficult to do, and it's very hard when you're just exhausted and you really want to just sit down in that comfortable chair or fall asleep in your bed. But if it's possible to make that transition something where you can truly know that you have taken every step that you possibly can to make sure that you're protecting the safety of your children and family while you're also doing your work. That then, I think, provides a kind of inner security that enables healthcare workers and other essential employees to be very present with their children and families. And that then, of course, is the big challenge. If mostly you're worried about protecting them from yourself, or if you're mentally still back there in your workspace, which is perfectly understandable, all of that comes between you and being together with your children, your spouse, your partner, your family. And there's no way to absolutely prevent that, but every time that kind of a mindful ritual is undertaken, it's a way of shifting and coming back from the workplace to the home. And I think that's what makes the biggest difference.
Yeah, I mean, going back to your, your 3 steps of figuring out how do I shift out of this one mindset and also just physically shift. I do think there really is something to that ritual to just help you transition and then be available, be present and think clearly. And the thinking clearly part, as you said, might be maybe the biggest challenge of this if my head is still at work or something that happened. And so how do I really shift into being present for my family? So that's helpful.
One
Thank
other
you.
thing I've heard, just in case it's helpful, I've heard from a number of healthcare workers who are parents that they've had a unique stressor happen at home, and that is they've been told that they have to stay apart from the rest of their family, by the family themselves, sometimes by their own children.
Right.
You got to stay over in your room because you got to make sure that we don't get that virus from you. And that can feel like a rejection. That can feel like, the people in my family don't want to be around me, or they think that I'll bring something terrible home, and that now all my worst fears are actually realized. When in fact, what that is it's a really important statement on the part of the family members that they trust their family member, in this case, the parent, enough to realize that they're not saying we don't want to be with you. They're saying we've learned from you enough to know that we all have to be safe. And if that means being separated physically for some periods of time, then we're willing to do that. And instead of saying that in the nicest, most polite fashion, sometimes it just gets said the way that family messages get said, which is
Right.
go to your room.
Yep. Yeah. You, mom, go to your room.
The message
Exactly.
take home is we know that you are protecting us and we want to protect you, but we also want to let you know that we've learned from you that even though we want to be together, if this is a period of time where we need to be separated, then we're going to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And that, I mean, that is so hard. I really like the way you've reframed that as to it's that idea of hearing through the words, like really what's underneath what your kids are saying in that context. And that's about the hardest thing you can ask a parent, right? Is to separate from their child as a way to actually keep their child safe. And so it's, several members of my family, including me, had COVID. And so we had those periods of like when both my husband and I had it and like, how can we tend to our kids who don't have it? It was just this gut wrenching decision making and risk benefit analysis of constantly like, okay, when kids need you, but what really helped, I think, through that, which is a lot of what you're saying too, is this idea that this isn't going to be forever. And because it's back to that insecurity for kids, if I can just keep reminding them that here's how it's going to be, we have this many more days of this, and then mom's going to be able to do this. And it's just continuing to make things predictable for them to restore that sense of security. Because, when mom or dad or, can't be present for me, that's scary for a child. And so I think in your context too, with the reverse example, it's just everybody remembering this is for a period of time. This is the way that I can love you and keep you safe right now, as hard as that is. So yeah, that's great.
Exactly.
So I want to just sort of wrap up with a couple final questions, which is, we've been talking a lot about trauma specifically, how it impacts families. And, maybe parents have heard a lot, and certainly mental health professionals have heard a lot about this idea of being trauma informed. It's a term that's used in a lot of different contexts. And so I wondered if you had thoughts, because you've worked and done a lot of consulting for people around what does it mean to be trauma informed and trauma responsive. What does trauma informed parenting look like?
It looks like really good, caring parenting. It doesn't look like superhero parenting. It doesn't look like parents who are able to do things that no other parent can do. It looks like regular people who are making a concerted effort, who are being very thoughtful and intentional about maintaining their own health and well-being and protecting and maintaining the health and the well-being of their children. I know that sounds very basic and almost simplistic, but it really is the case that to be trauma informed is to recognize that when any of us experience stressors in our lives, major challenges or threats, even if they're very distant, when they impact us and they cause us to feel insecure, and parents feel insecure just as much as children do, when we experience that sense of insecurity that comes along with extreme stress or trauma, that being trauma informed means recognizing this is a reaction I'm having because my body is recognizing that this is a big challenge, and I have to now pay extra attention to maintaining that presence that I want to have for myself and for my children. So being trauma informed is really, it goes back, forgive me for being repetitive, but it goes back to that ABC approach.
Yeah.
Because if you're available, if you are being present and you're believing in your child, and if you are thinking clearly and helping your child to think clearly, that's what enables people to go through trauma, recover from it, and in some cases to actually prevent stress from being traumatic, because it's scary, but that kind of security that you just described, if you have that foundation of security as a child, and you know that your parent or parents are going to be there for you, they're not perfect, sometimes they mess up, Sometimes they don't understand, but you know that fundamentally they believe in you and they will help you figure out whatever needs to be figured out. That sometimes can make the difference between a stressor being manageable versus being traumatic.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you could give parents one last message as you send them back off into their pandemic parenting, what would that be?
Take some time today and every day and just clear your mind. And no matter what else is going on, just be immediately available and quiet your own mind in any way that you want to. Be as present as you can in your own body, and just take a moment and just allow your body to relax. And then think for just a moment about what is it in your life at this moment that is most important. It might be your children, it might be your spouse, it might be your work, it might be something else. But if you can do that, and you can do that more than once, maybe even once every day or a few times every day, then you're preparing yourself for the biggest challenge that any of us face, which is to help, as a parent, help our children to grow up successfully. And we'll all be very grateful to you for doing that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing all of your great wisdom and experience with us today.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Pandemic Parenting Podcast. Make sure to hit follow or subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whichever platform you're listening on to be notified of future episodes. We'd also love to connect with you on social media. Look for our blue and yellow logo when you search Pandemic Parenting on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or YouTube, and you'll find us. Or follow the links in the show notes.
Let us know what you think of this episode by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. Your 5-star review helps us move up the charts to reach even more parents and caregivers. If you have a specific question or topic you'd like us to address in a future episode, let us know. You can email info@pandemic-parent.org and mention podcast in the subject line.
And this podcast isn't all we do, by the way. Pandemic Parenting is a 501c3 nonprofit providing free science-based resources for parents and all who care for children while navigating the COVID-19 pandemic. To learn more about our organization and access our extensive library of webinars, videos, blogs, and more, visit www.pandemic-parent.org.
Lastly, this show wouldn't be possible without supporters like you. Lindsay and I donate our time to this podcast, but we do have an incredible team working behind the scenes to make this all happen. If you'd like to support the show beyond leaving your 5-star review, visit www.pandemic-parent.org/support and donate today.
Thanks for listening. Hope you can join us next time.